tonight we're very pleased to have with us Scott Macfie. And Scott is, now many of you here are from or have a connection to Dumfries House, and I hope you're very much looking forward to seeing Scott's talk tonight. Scott is a guide at Dumfries House, as I believe that many of you are, but not only that, he is also an established scholar in his own right. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of Glasgow, and his talk this evening is going to be on, well, I'm sure you already know what it's about. It's about the second Earl of Stair and his spy network in the sort of post-1715 period, so tracking down and squashing Jacobites. At least that's what we're hoping. That's what we're hoping to hear about. This is a piece of research that Scott did prior to his doctorate, but he's returned to it recently to jazz it up for us. For now, I think it's over to Scott for his dazzling talk on the Hanoverian Spymaster, the second Earl of Stair.
Thank you, Stu, for that very lovely introduction. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. And thank you to all of you for coming along to this online talk. As I was saying to Stu earlier, the fact that we've got double figures for this amazed me. So thank you all for coming along. Yes, tonight I'm going to be talking about the man on the right-hand side of the slide, John Dalrymple, the second Earl of Stair, especially focusing on his years as British ambassador to France. That's between January 1715 until his recall in June 1720. And mostly going to be focusing on this spy network that he developed in order to keep tabs on senior Jacobites living in France. And so we said from pretty much the beginning of his time in Paris, this was a clear instruction to him from his superiors in Whitehall. Got this little quote on the slide from one of his superiors in Whitehall, James Stanhope. He's telling Stair, spare no expense nor labour to procure the surest intelligence of what is passing in relation to the Pretender. The reason why the government in Whitehall is so keen to know what's happening with the Jacobites in France is because in 1715, the Hanoverian dynasty is pretty insecure on the throne. King George I had only acceded to the throne in August 1714, so less than 6 months after Stair goes to France. He succeeds the last of the Stuart monarchs, Queen Anne, and to get to the throne, King George jumps ahead of 50 claimants with a better blood claim to the throne. He jumps ahead of them because he's a Protestant and they are Catholic. The senior of these better Catholic claimants is the man on the right-hand side of this slide, James Francis Edward Stuart, or better known as the Old Pretender. And I'm going to call him the Pretender for the rest of this talk because that's how he's referred to in these documents that I'm using, just for clarity's sake. Yes, he was the son of James II, the Catholic king who was deposed and forced to go into exile in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution. And in 1715, the Pretender, he was living in Lorraine, just across the border from France on the German side. And Stair's job in France is to keep an eye on what's happening both at Lorraine and in Paris itself. As I'll mention later on in the talk, Paris is one of the key centres of the Jacobite community at this time. Well, right, jump ahead. Historians must have said from the start they're pretty divided on Lord Stair as an ambassador, whether he was really successful or not. Some are very complimentary. Back in the 19th century, A.T. Thompson praised Stair's courtesy, shrewdness, and diligence, and the brilliant and spirited manner in which he conducted his diplomatic duties. And in the 20th century, we got John Baines calling Stair a clever man who succeeded admirably as ambassador. But in contrast to this, also some pretty damning criticism. Jeremy Black called Stair a blunt soldier who caused defence. I will go back. Yeah, blunt soldier who caused defence. And then we got James Buchan, who wrote this biography of John Law. I'm going to mention Law at the very end of this talk. He was, if you like, Stair's antagonist in France. So Buchan is already anti-Stair at the very beginning, and he does not hold back, as you see in this quote. He calls Stair arrogant beyond measure, overbearing, avaricious, rough, an uncontrollable gambler, a Protestant bigot, and false as a jeton. not very complimentary. We've got this very clear divide between glowing praise and pretty damning criticism of Lord Stair. I hope it shows the need to re-examine his career as ambassador. And I'm hoping that by looking at his spy network in particular, we can shed some new light on Lord Stair's skill as ambassador. That's my hope, anyway. And a lot of this criticism that's directed at Stair comes from the memoirs of another one of his antagonists. As I mentioned later on, Stair made quite a few enemies in France. This antagonist is the man on the right-hand side of this slide, the Duc de Saint-Simon. His memoirs are one of the great historical sources for the court of King Louis XIV of France at Versailles, because his memoirs are stock full of gossip. Saint-Simon remembered every bit of gossip you could think of for all the courtiers at Versailles, and he wrote these pretty malicious pen portraits of the courtiers. Must be said, Saint-Simon was not very fond of anybody, and he could not stand Lord Stair. Here are only a few things he'd called Lord Stair. Apparently, Stair carried his head high with a most insolent expression. He was poor, with expensive tastes, a Scotch gentleman of no very distinguished birth. He hated France most cordially. He raised so many quibbles and disputes that the general opinion was that he was sent here rather to pick a quarrel than to look after the affairs of his country. And as you can see from the later historical sources, a lot of them take Saint-Simon's word for it. They place an awful lot of trust in Saint-Simon, and they have a very negative perception of Stair. But Saint-Simon cannot be called an unbiased source. He disliked Stair personally, and he was very anti-British, very sort of Anglophobic. So he was predisposed to dislike him. So my hope is to look beyond this caricature of Stair as this, poor, proud, rude Scotsman, and try and shine some light on his genuine skill as ambassador. Looking at the spy network, was he supplying good intelligence for the British government? Was it stuff they could actually use to counter the Jacobite threat? That is my intention for this evening. And before I kick off, good to say that most of the sources I'm using for this talk are taken from letters that Stair wrote himself. These were letters he either wrote to his superiors at Whitehall, they are stored in the National Archives at Kew, or letters he wrote to his friends in Scotland, and they are mostly stored in Edinburgh at the National Records of Scotland office. There is also fragments of a diary that Stair kept in France during his first year there in 1715. That's fragmentary, sadly. And when it comes to the spy network, again, equally sadly, very few sources survive for it. And this is mostly due to the nature of early modern espionage. Very little is written down, and what was written down was usually destroyed in order to protect the identity of informants. So, luckily, a couple of records survive for a couple of Stair's informants. They've left written accounts of a couple of their missions they were sent on by Stair, but it's cobbling together fragments to try and provide kind of a tapestry for Lord Stair's spy network. Not much evidence, but doing my best to flesh out what evidence we do have. So, to start at the beginning, why was Lord Stair appointed as the British ambassador to France? I would argue for three main reasons. Firstly, his staunch Whig family background. Secondly, his previous distinguished military career. And thirdly, his previous diplomatic experience. And looking at his family background, Saint-Simon was a bit unkind when he called Stair a man of no distinguished birth, but he's not that far away from the truth. The Stair title was only 2 generations old, and it was first given to this man on the right-hand side of the slide, to James Dalrymple, his grandfather. And for a little bit of context for why the fact that Stair is a Whig is so important, in 1714, during the last days of the reign of Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, there was a Tory ministry in power. And this Tory ministry was pretty sympathetic to the Jacobites. They came very close to offering the throne to the pretender. So, unsurprisingly, when George I takes power, he dismisses this pro-Tory pro-Jacobite Tory government, dismisses them, and he brings in their opponents, the Whigs, to form a new government. And this Whig government and King George, they are looking for a man they can trust in France. As I'll mention later, France was the main centre for the Jacobites at this time. They want someone who's not going to go native, if you like, a Tory gentleman who might be swayed towards the Jacobite side. They want a staunch Whig. They get that in Stair. He's got a lot. The Dalrymples have got this long opposition to the Jacobites. The Dalrymples, they were originally based in Ayrshire, but by the 18th century, they owned an awful lot of land in Wigtonshire, especially around about Stranraer in southwest Scotland. And starting with his grandfather, James Dalrymple, he was a very distinguished lawyer. But in 1682, he fled into exile, fled Scotland to oppose the absolutist and anti Presbyterian policies of King Charles II and then later of his brother, James II. Dalrymple goes into exile to Holland, and there he meets William of Orange. And he becomes a very early supporter of William of Orange's invasion in 1688. And when William takes power as William III, he rewards Stair. He gives him the title, he rewards Dalrymple. He gives him the title Viscount Stair in gratitude for his long-term support. So his grandfather, a very early opponent of James II and the Jacobites. And his son, that is our Lord Stair's father, equally anti-Jacobite. His father, John Dalrymple, the first Earl of Stair, is really one of the great pantomime villains of Scottish history, because he was the man who signed the warrant for the massacre of the MacDonald family of Glencoe. They were Jacobites, signed the warrant for the massacre in February 1692. So both his father and his grandfather made their careers on opposing the Jacobites, staying loyal to William of Orange and to the principles of the Glorious Revolution, and very anti-Jacobite. So when George I is casting about for an appointment for the British ambassador to France, Stair is kind of an ideal candidate. He shares his father and his grandfather's opposition to the Jacobites. He's a man they feel they can trust in France. And alongside his, great Whig credentials, Stair had also enjoyed a very distinguished military career. And when he becomes ambassador, he's in his early 40s, and through his entire adult life until that point, he had been a soldier. Most recently, he had been a soldier under John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, during the War of the Spanish Succession, and he'd been present at all the great battles of the war. And you may think this is not necessarily a point in his favour when looking for an ambassador to represent the British throne in France at the court of Louis XIV. It does seem odd on the face of it to appoint a soldier who spent his whole life fighting Louis XIV. But King George I was a former soldier himself, and he was known to display marked preference towards fellow soldiers when it came to making these political appointments. So he and Stair had this kind of rapport, and for a former soldier like King George, Stair was an ideal candidate. And Stair also had some previous diplomatic experience. He had been envoy extraordinary to Poland in 1710. So together, his political background, his previous military experience, his diplomatic experience, they make him a pretty ideal candidate to send to France. Why did Lord Stair accept the appointment? To put it bluntly, he was in desperate need of the money. In 1715, Stair was in debt. With the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, he had lost his place in the army, and there's a letter he wrote to the Duke of Marlborough only a couple of months before he goes to France, saying he can't even afford the £3,000 required to pay for a commission to get a regiment in the British Army. But as the British ambassador in France, he'll get a weekly salary of £100. Trying to convert 18th century money into 21st century currency is notoriously difficult. To the best of my knowledge, well, after a quick Google search, apparently £100 in the early 1700s is about £30,000 today. So Lord Stair getting £30,000 as British ambassador. So that is a big inducement for quite a poor Scottish nobleman like himself. And he goes to France in January 1715. And at this point, France is the centre for the Jacobite cause. He goes to France with two aims of maintaining amicable relations with the French government, but also to keep tabs on the Jacobite cause with his spy network. Well, since 1688, when King James II had been forced to flee England, he'd been given refuge in France by King Louis XIV. Louis XIV gave the Stuart family the Palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, French royal palace that lies about 12 miles from Paris. The Stuarts had given access to this palace. And the pretender, he'd been forced to leave France in 1713. So he had gone to live in Lorraine on the German side of the French border. But his mother, Mary of Modena, the lady on the right hand side of the slide, and widow of King James II, she was allowed to remain. And she lived at Saint Germain until her death in 1718. So during much of Steyre's time in Paris, in France, Saint-Germain remained a key centre of the Jacobite government, as did Lorraine across the border. So he's in Paris, he's kind of ideally placed to keep tabs not only on Lorraine, he can send informants backwards and forwards, but he can also keep tabs on Saint-Germain and senior Jacobites living in Paris as well. So he's ideally placed. And when it comes to trying to remain informed about what's happening at the Jacobite court, the best way for him to do this is with his spy network. And if we are to believe his official biographer, Andrew Henderson, Steyre was very personally involved with his spy network. This biography was published a year after Steyre's death in 1748. And according to Henderson, during his time in Paris, Steyre entertained all the great and the good of Paris at these great parties. But at around 10 o'clock, Steyre would pretend business and leave the company to the care of his lady, withdraw to his room, undress himself, and repair to coffee houses incognito, and by a dexterous method of conversation found out the secrets of the day. I love this idea of Steyre living this sort of superhero life of his ordinary ambassador by day and an international spy by night. Sadly, I think this is his biographer showing some creative license, some creative liberty. As the British ambassador, Steyre was a pretty recognizable figure in France. I'd be amazed if there was any Jacobite living in Paris who did not know his face. So it would be an awful risk for Steyre to go to these coffee houses, to these taverns, and try and converse with Jacobites, try and get secrets out of them. If nothing else, it would be dreadfully embarrassing if he was discovered, if he was caught out. It would be an embarrassment both to himself and to the British government, showing this very sort of clumsy way of trying to get intelligence. This biography comes out 30 years after the event it describes. Steyre is dead at this point. I think it's a biographer trying to spice up the life of his protagonist. Probably better to see Lord Steyre rather than an active spy himself, better to see him as a coordinator. He's the man who is recruiting spies and sending them out off on their missions. But he is active as this coordinating figure. And from the evidence that I've found, it seems to be that informants approached Steyre rather than the other way around. We got this letter, the first bullet point, from Father James McLaughlin. He was an Irish priest living in Paris, and he promises Steyre he can, detect and make manifest all the schemes and disaffected persons against the present king. That's James George I and the government of England. He's swearing he can provide Steyre with the best intelligence of these Jacobite schemes. And we see again, if we look to the second bullet point, Steyre recording in his diary in July 1715, he did a meeting with this Mr. H. Even in his diary, Steyre is using these code names. He's trying to protect the identity of his informants. It does mean we don't know an awful amount about the biographies of his informants. He records this person, he'd come to him. He wants to have a regiment in the service of Hanover, and he promised to do his part to discover what was doing for the pretender. So both these examples showing that informants are approaching Steyre, and they're offering their intelligence in exchange for some sort of payment, either in money or, in the case of Mr. H, a commission in the army. Steyre's military background, his close connections to the Whig government in London, it means he's got an awful lot of potential rewards he can offer to informants. It means he can really reward his spies quite well. This does present the risk that his informants may not be necessarily honest, that they might fabricate their intelligence simply to get the reward money from Steyre. And there are a number of times during, especially the 1715 Rising, where Steyre is reporting false intelligence to the British government. And this could be because his spies are simply fabricating intelligence. They're telling him what he wants to hear just to make sure they get the reward. It's kind of an inherent problem in the nature of early modern espionage. How much can you really trust the information you're getting? How much can you trust your spies, especially when they're usually very desperate people doing what they can to make some casual money? But when it comes to sadly, we don't have a list of Stair spies. We don't know exactly how many spies he kept in his employment at any one time. The best information we've got is actually his expenses sheets. I told you earlier the evidence we've got for his spy network is fragmentary. So for the 5.5 years of his time in France, we've only got his expenses sheets for 9 months of that time. These were the sheets he sent to his superiors in Whitehall, claiming the expenses he was racking up in his spy network. Well, the first of these sheets covers the months between October and December 1715, and he reports he'd spent just over £1,000 on his intelligence gathering. So this is around about um, £100 is about £30,000 a day. £1,000 is about £30,000. About 30,000, no, £300,000 being spent on intelligence in a quarter. We see in the next quarter, from December 1715 to March 1716, he's spending about the same amount, just shy of £1,000. Now, there's a bit of a gap, but in the third and final expenses sheet to survive that covers June to September 1716, he's spending a little bit more, closer to £1,500. This is interesting because those first 6 months, they cover the peak period of the 1715 Jacobite Rising, and I'll get to that in a couple minutes. So this was probably the most intense period of activity for Stair during his time in France, when he was doing the most, spy mastering, if you like, sending agents out on missions. There's an awful lot happening in France he has to keep his eye on. So you'd think that's when he'd be spending the most money. But no, he's spending much more money in summer 1716, when, to be honest, there's not that much happening. The Jacobite Rising had finished about 6 months earlier, and it had left the Jacobites quite deflated. So during 1716, there really isn't that much happening. There's not really that much for Stair to keep his eye on. So you could interpret this information in two ways. If you're generous like me, it sounds as though Lord Stair is actually being quite diligent. His spy network doesn't seem to be reactive. He's not just reacting to Jacobite plots. He's trying to preempt them. Even during a time of apparent calm, he's still employing his informants. He's still trying to keep tabs on the Jacobites. He wants to stay that one step ahead. He doesn't want to respond to a plot. He wants to get prior knowledge of it and kind of prevent it if he can. Or you could be more unkind, and you could think that Stair is just fiddling his expenses. And this is understandable. Certainly, several of his contemporaries and also several historians do believe this, that Stair was using these expenses sheets to cover up a very lavish lifestyle. And they're not entirely wrong. Stair did lead a very lavish lifestyle in France. He arrived in France during the last days of the reign of King Louis XIV. Stair arrives in France in January 1715. Louis XIV dies in the September. And for those 8 months, the royal court is at the Palace of Versailles. Stair participates fully in the court life at Versailles. He records in his diary, he goes to the palace, he travels from Paris to Versailles, and he attends the king's levee. That is the ceremony when the king is dressed by his courtiers in the morning. And Stair also goes to watch the king dine in public in front of the assembled royal court. He is really socializing with the elite of the French court. But Louis XIV was not terribly popular by the end of his reign. He'd become quite pious, quite dour. The court life had become very strictly regimented, and he'd dragged France into a number of very expensive wars during his lifetime. So by 1715, France is pretty nearly bankrupt. When he dies in September 1715, he's succeeded by his infant great-grandson. That's King Louis XV. Louis XV is only 5 years old when he gets the throne, and there is this sense, a palpable sense of relief in France. There's this idea of this a new age has begun under this new boy king, and it's known usually as the period of the Regency. The regency named after the regent, the man on the left-hand side of the slide. This is Philippe Duc d'Orléans. He served as regent for the boy king Louis XV from 1715 to 1723. And this time in French history is remembered as a very sort of light-hearted time. The old strictures of the very pious Louis XIV's reign have been lifted. Uh, Philippe d'Orléans is a bit of a libertine figure, and the rest of French society follows suit. The royal court moves from Versailles back to Paris. It's based at the Palace of the Tuileries, and Paris itself is a very fun place to be. At this time, there are around 400 coffee houses in Paris. There are several salons, theatres, balls to attend, and Stair does seem to make the most of his time there. There are letters in the archive where he's corresponding with Voltaire, the French philosopher. Stair clearly attending these literary salons. He's hobnobbing with the great and the good, the great intellectuals of French society. He's making the most of his time there. And we know a bit about Stair's romantic life. Comes from the Regent Duke Orleans, his mother, Elizabeth, the Dowager Duchess of Orleans. She's known as Madame at the French court, so that's what I've referred to her as. And just like Saint-Simon, she is a great gossip. And her letters to her various relations scattered across Europe, again, one of the best historical sources for French history at this time. Well, apparently, she tells us Lord Stair was violently smitten with a mistress called Madame Raymond. Nowadays, she has another love who causes my lord much heartburning. Lady Stair is thus avenged for her husband's infidelity. But apparently, Lord Stair suffered for his infidelity. She tells us Lord Stair was very ill, having been taught too much French by the French ladies. I am extremely sorry for his virtuous wife. I think that is Elizabeth's quite coy way of saying Stair has picked up some form of venereal disease during his romantic exploits. Poor Lady Stair, indeed. Again, showing you he's sort of throwing himself headlong into the social life of Paris. And he had a very lavish time in Paris. He tells us in his correspondence that he spent, since living in France, bought in furniture and plate and jewels very considerably over £10,000. £10,000 spent on furniture, plate, and jewels. That's a colossal sum of money. We're talking about £2 million or so just on soft furnishings and jewellery. And we get potentially an inkling into Stair's very lavish lifestyle in Paris from a suite of 4 tapestries that are now on display at Dumfries House. As Stu mentioned in his introduction, I am a guide there. And for any of you who attended Lindy's fantastic talk on the Earls of Dumfries back in spring, you'll be very familiar with Dumfries House. It's the home of the Earl of Stair's nephew. And on his death, 4 tapestries owned by the Earl of Stair pass on to his nephew, William, the Earl of Dumfries. That's why these tapestries are now at Dumfries House. Suite of 4, they show you 4 gods and goddesses from classical mythology. The one on the slide shows you the goddess Minerva in the center, an olive branch in the hand, and it's a scene that celebrates the fruits of peace. To the left, in the cave, Minerva has Mars, the god of war, in chains, showing she's banished war, and she now enjoys a much more prosperous future, with being presented with the riches and the arts, the sciences. It's this allegory for the fruits of peace. You can only prosper when you've banished war. Now, these tapestries, they were made in Brussels by Lenia Raindam in 1717. And this date makes it quite tempting to presume that they were purchased by Stair during his time as ambassador. Sadly, we don't have any evidence for when he actually purchased the tapestries. We can't say definitively, but I would love the idea, with this one in particular, that's twin themes of war and peace. These are the defining aims of his time as ambassador. He's doing his best to stave off a Jacobite plot, trying to maintain peace in England and Britain. So tempted to think he may have bought these tapestries at that time. There's no evidence one way or the other. He could well have bought them in the 1740s. He was later a field marshal during the War of the Austrian Succession. He may have bought them then. We can't know. But it's quite tempting to think this is insight into his very lavish Parisian lifestyle. These 4 tapestries hanging in the embassy in Paris, but we can't say for certain. And he also received criticism for his gambling. And we have this letter from Fanny Oglethorpe, who was a Jacobite living in France, who tells us that Stair had been forced to go to a country house outside Paris because he'd lost all his money at cards and has not the wherewithal to finish furnishing his house nor make the figure that is fit. And these rumours that Stair is gambling away his expense sheets on the card tables, these rumours get back to Whitehall, and superiors are very unimpressed. We have this letter from James Craggs, a government minister. He tells Stair, "Your expenses are exorbitant. I do not see how they were made up to you. You cannot imagine what prejudice your play at cards does with everybody, and how much it enervates the attempts of your friends to serve you. There is a suspicion at the time Stair is fiddling his expenses. He's just covering up this very lavish lifestyle, his gambling, his furnishing the embassy. But I will say, both Stair's Jacobite opponents and his superiors in Britain, they are convinced that he's got this very big spy network. And from the documents I've been able to look through, he does seem to have been devoting an awful lot of energy to espionage. We can't say one way or the other whether his expense sheets really are genuine, whether they don't conceal his gambling debts. I would say he is channeling an awful lot of energy into anti-Jacobite spy network. I think we can be generous and just say we can't know for certain, but certainly he was living it up in Paris, this poor Scotsman making the most of his time in France. But to get down to the spy network itself, which I'm sure you want to talk about, I'm mostly going to focus on the Jacobite Rising of 1715. It started off only a couple of months after Stair arrived in France. To give you a very basic timeline, the Jacobites had been plotting throughout the summer of 1715, but the rising really takes off on the 6th of September 1715 when John Erskine, Earl of Mar, raised the Jacobite standard at Braemar. And Jacobites quickly muster a force of nearly 20,000 men. The 1715 Rising is less famous than the later 45 Rising, led by the Pretender's son, Bonnie Prince Charlie. But this rising, the earlier one of 1715, poses a much bigger threat to the British government. There's far more popular support for the Jacobite cause at this point, and there are far more men in the field under the Jacobite standard. So, a huge threat to the Hanoverian regime. Well, there's big support in Scotland and Northern England. Sadly for the Jacobites, they faced the British government forces at the Battle of Sheriffmuir in November 1715 and ends pretty much in a stalemate, which for a rising is almost as bad as a defeat. Any kind of stopping of momentum is disastrous, and it is for the Jacobites and for the Scottish Jacobites. Support quickly fades after Sheriffmuir. And even worse, only the next day, the English Jacobites defeated at the Battle of Preston. So even though the Pretender is eventually able to get to Scotland, a month later, on the 22nd of December 1715, he joins a losing cause. He stays in Scotland for around about 5 to 6 weeks, but his supporters have all dissipated. He's forced to flee back to France, and the rising peters out. And eventually, estimated about 2,000 Scottish Jacobites follow the Pretender, and they're forced to go into exile after the failed rising. While Stair has a very big role to play in the rising because, as I mentioned, the Jacobite centre of gravity at this time was in France, around about Paris in particular. And it's Stair who gives the British government the first inkling that something is afoot with the Jacobites. In July 1715, he writes to the government saying there's a plot to invade southwest England. And very quickly, the Parliament is called, 21 regiments raised, the southwest is pacified. It never becomes a big centre, a theatre for during the rising itself. It's pacified. And this early warning means that when the Earl of Mar raises Jacobite standards in September 1715, just 6 weeks later, the government are prepared. They're forewarned. So this is one of the great successes that Lord Stair has. Not entirely sure how he finds this information out, he doesn't tell us, but looking at his diary from 1715, he was constantly sending informants to Lorraine, to the Pretender's court across the French border, and doing his best to kind of tail the senior Jacobite leaders. So perhaps one of these informants is the one who exposes the plot. And this the southwest had been what had hoped to be the main target for the Jacobites. They're forced to change and head for Scotland instead. So they're very successfully foiling that part of the rising. But we have a clearer idea of what happens during the rising from two of Stair's informants. Two informants have left us a written record of the missions they were sent on. Because after Lord Stair has found out something's afoot in July 1715, he ramps up his espionage efforts. And the first of these informants is Dr. Literal. Don't know his first name. Dr. Literal was in Paris one day and he was in a tavern and found out that there was this rumor that the Jacobite invasion fleet was being prepared off the Normandy coast. So he comes to Stair, and apparently Stair ordered me to go up on the coast and inform myself with all expedition and diligence of that matter, the potential invasion fleet, with a particular instruction to spare no money, which could facilitate my inquiry. Quite revealing, this. And this, I must say, is taken from a report that Literal writes after he comes back from this mission. It tells us, firstly, it's a very quick turnaround. He approaches Stair, and that very evening he sets off for Le Havre. Stair has a sense of urgency. He's not wasting any time. And this particular quote, spare no money, spare no expense, it lends some credence to the idea that Stair is actually he's spending an awful lot of money on his informants. He's sparing no expense. It does lend credence to the idea that he's not necessarily being that dishonest. He's spending an awful lot of money in France. It's not all going to his lavish lifestyle. Actually, a lot of it is going towards his spy network. He's sparing no expense. Well, Literal gets to Le Havre, and he discovers these two ships being loaded with muskets, sword, powder, and ball, and about 14,000 louis d'or bound for the north of Scotland. They're being prepared by the Jacobites. Literal is able to discover them and somehow send word to Stair. But poor, hapless Literal, he arouses the suspicion of the local French authorities at the port. He's showing too much interest in these ships. And the French authorities imprison him for 33 days when he says he suffered all hardships imaginable. So somehow between discovering the ships and being imprisoned, he gets word to Stair, and Stair quickly goes to the regent, the Duke of Orleans, and he persuades him to impound the ammunition, prevents the ammunition from getting to Scotland from supporting the Jacobite cause. This is arguably Stair's biggest achievement as the ambassador, that he's able to prevent these essential supplies getting to the Jacobites that could have helped to sustain the rising. And our second informant is William Beauvoir. He was the chaplain to the British Embassy. Very fortunately, in Stair's own handwriting, we have got the instructions that he gives to Beauvoir for this mission. He sends him off to Bordeaux, and there's pretty similar instructions given to Literal. Apparently, Beauvoir is to use your best diligence to be informed whether there are any ship or ships then freighted for transporting any persons into England, such as the Pretender himself or any belonging to him. Like Literal, go to a port, keep your eyes open, prevent any Jacobite ammunitions, any Jacobites themselves from heading for Scotland. And she says to him, if he finds any Jacobites, he's to immediately go to the commanding officer of the place and stop them embarking. So it's more than just these spies passively informing what's happening. Stair wants them to intervene to prevent these ammunition, prevent these Jacobites going to support the rising. And a bit like Literal poor Beauvoir, he arouses suspicion of the local authorities. Stair spies, they come across quite hapless at times. This time, Beauvoir is threatened with imprisonment. He takes the hint. He quickly flees Bordeaux. Not very much is happening, though, in southwest France at this time. But these two accounts together, they show Stair's line of thought. He wants to keep his eyes open on all of the French ports. He knows that the French centre of gravity is France. To get any supplies or men to Scotland, will have to leave by a French port. He wants to be kept informed and get to either prevent that ammunition going or get word to the British government, ASAP. Well, these aren't his only methods. Besides monitoring the French ports, he also tails some senior Jacobite figures, one of whom was the Duke of Ormond. He apparently writes in his diary that he sends his maitre d'hotel to follow the Duke of Ormond when he's supposed to be setting out for Cherbourg. Again, get word of a Jacobite going to Scotland. Well, we hear from James Stanhope, his superior in Whitehall, that even Stair apparently has told Stanhope of this mission, that he's sent someone to go and tail the Duke of Ormond. Well, Stanhope tells us, we have heard nothing of your maitre d'hotel, whom in one of your letters you mentioned to have sent after Duke of Ormond. Apparently, Stair has lost contact with this informant. It tells us that he is doing his best to pass on all of his latest developments to his superiors in Whitehall, but he has this inherent problem in espionage at the time. How do you keep tabs on your informants when they are miles away across France? And there are evidently times when he loses contact with his informants. And there are other mistakes that he encounters. For example, his secretary, Thomas Crawford, writes to Whitehall saying, all Lord Stair's advices agree the Pretender is gone for Scotland. That's in November 1715. Well, no, the Pretender doesn't set sail for another month until the 27th of December. So, a glaring mistake on the part of Stair's informants. And this could be down to what I mentioned earlier. These mercenary men, they are providing perhaps false intelligence, telling Stair what he wants to hear to get their payment. But this kind of mistake can only have hampered the British government. It prevents them from really accurately responding to the Jacobite threat when they don't even know where the Pretender is. They're convinced he's set off for Scotland, and really he's still travelling about northern France at this point. Arguably, Stair's biggest mistake is he lets the Pretender slip through his fingers. The Pretender is able to embark for France. Well, embark for Scotland. This would be a particularly embarrassing mistake if we are to believe Saint-Simon, because in his memoirs, Saint-Simon accuses Stair of trying to assassinate the Pretender during his journey across France. The Pretender spends about 5 or 6 weeks kind of manically going across France, trying to find a ship that will take him to Scotland. And if we were to believe Saint-Simon, Stair finds out that the Pretender is going to stop at Chateau Thierry on the 2nd of November, 1715, and that determined to rid his party, if he could, of this last scion of the Stuarts, he hired an assassin, Colonel Douglas, to assassinate the Pretender. Well, in common with most of Stair's spies, Douglas gets himself imprisoned during his mission. Apparently, he arouses too much suspicion at Chateau Thierry, and his landlady imprisons him in his room. So the Pretender is able to pass quite safely through Chateau Thierry unharmed. And eventually, Stair has to go to the regent, the Duke of Orleans, to get Douglas released from his imprisonment. Well, historians and people at the time, and later historians, they have pretty casually just gone along with the story that, of course, Stair did try to assassinate the Pretender. Well, looking at the evidence, as I said earlier, Saint-Simon is, you cannot call him an unbiased source. He was very antagonistic to Stair. He'd happily believe the rest of him. Looking at Stair's expenses sheets, we can at least say for certain he did definitely employ Colonel Douglas. Apparently, between October and December 1715, he gave him £130, which is a colossal amount of money, nearly, apparently in today's money, about £40,000. Unsurprisingly, Stair does not write very neatly on this expenses sheet, £130 to Colonel Douglas for, expenses in trying to assassinate the Pretender. It doesn't say that. You could believe with this extortionate amount of money, it can only be for a job as, serious as trying to kill the last of the Stuarts. Or it could simply be that Douglas was employed to tail the Pretender, to go and monitor a French port, like Literal and like Beauvoir before him. We can't know for certain, but he was definitely a spy in Stair's employ. But I think some evidence that casts some doubt on Stair's guilt are 2 letters he wrote to his friend, Duke of Montrose, back in Scotland. In December 1715, before the Pretender actually embarks for Scotland, he writes, and this is actually a letter that's written after Sheriffmuir, after the Jacobite forces have been defeated. Stair writes, I wish the affair had been decided at once, and that the Pretender had landed. He wishes that the Pretender had been present at this debacle, the Battle of Sheriffmuir, and that he'd been personally implicated in this embarrassing defeat. And then after the Pretenders actually landed in France and landed in Scotland, he writes this second letter to Montrose. He says, the Pretender being there himself is the luckiest thing that could have happened. He's thrilled the Pretender is there in person. He's personally implicated in the defeat of his supporters. It discredits his cause. If you're ungenerous, you could see this as Stair simply trying to explain away his failed assassination attempt. He's trying to make, excuse the fact that actually it's a good thing that he didn't actually kill the Pretender. It's a good thing he got to Scotland. It's actually doing quite a good thing for doing down the Jacobites. You could be more generous and see this as Stair consistently wishing the Pretender had actually gone to Scotland. It's actually a very good thing he's there in person. So it's a bit like with the gambling stories. There's evidence both on both sides in this instance. Personally, I don't think Stair would have taken a great risk of trying to assassinate his opponent. By the 18th century, assassinations is sort of taboo. You don't really you try. It would be an international debacle if the British ambassador had assassinated someone on French soil, especially when the Pretender had been for so long a guest of the French court. But we can't say one way or the other. Personally, I think the letters are a good way of saying, casting some doubt on his supposed guilt, but I will let you judge for yourselves with the court of public opinion. So, if we're looking back on the Jacobite Rising, I think that Stair's two main achievements are his early warning signal in July 1715. He gives the government some time to prepare for the Rising, and his impounding of the Jacobite ammunition ships in September 1715, denying the Jacobites some essential supplies. But there's a third, less concrete method of assessing his effectiveness of his spy network, and that is the effect his spy network had on his opponents, the Jacobite exiles living in France. Because it should be said, these Jacobites were absolutely terrified of Lord Stair. We see this from their correspondence. These two letters in the slide are from Henry St. John, Lord Bolingbroke. He was the Pretender's main councillor in France. Well, he writes to the Pretender as he sets off on his travels across northern France, desperate to find a port to get to Scotland. He writes that the Duke of Ormond's going off, this other Jacobite leader, has made Stair redouble his diligence. His spies are upon every road near the city. And then 2 weeks later, he says, Stair cannot be ignorant of the part of the coast from whence you are to proceed, and every moment after he has this knowledge adds to your danger. There is this sense of urgency, of paranoia in these letters. We've got other letters from Jacobites saying they're too scared to write letters and send them through the port of Calais because they are convinced that Lord Stair has bribed the Calais postmaster, that he's in his employ. They'll open their letters. There are other Jacobites saying they're too afraid to meet openly in the streets of Paris because they're convinced that Stair has got a spy tailing them. And if you read these letters, Stair emerges as this almost spider-like figure at the center of this web of informants. And this can only have hampered the effectiveness of the Jacobites' plotting, that they're too afraid to meet openly. They're too afraid to correspond openly. It just makes their plotting much less effective. And I think this is a really effective way of showing of a spy network, that it's not just the value of the information he provides, it's also the importance it has on the Jacobites themselves. It leaves them terrified. And it's quite fun reading these reports. Well, after the 1715 Rising, Stair keeps up his spy network, but it just becomes less vitally important to the British government. This is because after the 1715 Rising, the British government are able to put pressure on France to get the Pretender to flee further south. They tell him to flee Lorraine, to leave French soil, and the Pretender eventually settles in Italy, in Rome. So France becomes less important to the Jacobite cause. The Pretender's mother, Mary of Modena, dies in 1718. Saint-Germain becomes less of a centre for the Jacobites. Well, there is a later rising when Stair is in Paris, the rising of 1719. This one is supported by the Spanish government. Spanish fleet sets out for northern Scotland. Bad gales blow off most of the ships, but a couple do arrive in Scotland, and there's this battle at Glen Shiel when the Jacobites and the Spanish troops are defeated by the British government. Stair doesn't have much of a role to play in this because the main centre of gravity for this rising is in Italy, where the Jacobite court is based, and in Spain. So there's not much happening in France. There's not much that Stair's French spy network can really give to the government. But he keeps at it. And Sadly, his last years in France are blighted by this feud he has with his fellow Scot, John Law. And these final slides really analyse the downfall of Stair as ambassador. John Law was born in Edinburgh, was forced to flee England in 1694 after a duel where he killed his opponent. He flees to the continent and eventually gets into the good graces of Philippe the Regent, the Duke of Orleans. And he appoints John Law as the sort of the French finance minister because John Law has got this ingenious scheme to restore the French finances. They're bankrupt after the War of the Spanish Succession. John Law has this idea to establish a bank and establish a trading company to the French colony of Mississippi. And he guarantees this is going to repair the French finances. And it results in this bubble. People across France invest enormous amounts of money in this Mississippi trading company, and people start making enormous profits on their stocks. But this Mississippi trading company makes them no money. So there's all these people throwing money at the company, but there's no real way of giving them back their dividends. So quickly the bubble bursts. It wrecks the French economy. Bubble bursts in December 1720. By this point, Stair has left France. But he's hugely suspicious of John Law and his financial schemes. And he's pretty convinced that John Law is actually very sympathetic to the Jacobites. He writes home that he's been talking to the regent and he's been warning about Law, that by his vanity and presumption, John Law was leading the regent into great dangers and inconveniences both at home and abroad. Law was, by discourse and his conduct, doing everything that lay in his power to destroy the good understanding between the king, George I, and the regent Orleans. Stair is convinced that in trying to restore the French finances, John Law's main aim is to get France in a fit state to, declare war on England. That France's main goal is always going to be to expand their territories on the continent, and they're always going to be in conflict with Britain. Well, Stair makes an awful lot of fuss, and to be honest, him lobbying the French regent to get him to dismiss his finance minister is Stair stepping beyond his remit as ambassador. He's not really supposed to be intervening in French domestic politics, and it really annoys the French courtiers. We have this letter from Madame, the regent's mother. She tells him that after my son, the regent, has done everything he could to please him, Stair has turned his back on him and is giving him all the trouble he can. He has worried my son so much, he is very glad to be rid of him. Well, Stair makes rather a nuisance of himself with his pestering, with his conspiracy theories about John Law and his financial schemes. And he makes such a nuisance of himself, he cannot even stand to be in the same room as John Law by the early months of 1720 during his last months in Paris. The regent complains to the British government, and eventually they sacrifice Stair. They think he's making too much fuss, that in order to maintain good relationship with France, they have to dismiss Stair. It's better to maintain the alliance. And Stair leaves France in disgrace. He leaves France in June 1720. But it must be said, he leaves in very bad spirits. He thinks he has been betrayed by the British government, that he's doing his best to inform them of this great threat that John Law poses, and that he's being made a scapegoat. Well, his last letter home is full of bile. He is convinced that Law seems more bent than ever to do us mischief, believing it the only way he has left to save himself and his system. All over France, they talk of a war with Britain, and the Jacobites are in greater numbers at Paris than ever, and more insolent. I think we have nothing to fear from France at present but by surprise. But in my opinion, it will behove us to be very attentive against something of that kind. Here we have Stair, the warmonger. He is convinced that John Law is doing his best to stir up, a conflict between Britain and France. Now, we can sit here in the 21st century feeling quite smug. We know with hindsight that there was no war with France coming. Indeed, France and Britain didn't go to war again until the 1740s. We can think Stair is just being conspiracy theorist here. But we do have to remember, Stair had spent his entire adult life fighting the armies of King Louis XIV and his expansionist ambitions. It's not unreasonable to think that for him to think war is only a matter of time before it breaks out again. And we also must remember he'd faced an awful lot of opposition from the French government during its anti-Jacobite espionage. I mean, I mentioned earlier in 1715, at least two of his informants were imprisoned by French local officials when they were trying to oppose the Jacobite cause. He's quite justified in thinking that the French government may be hand in glove with the Jacobites. And even though I can't expand on it right now, John Law did have quite a pro-Jacobite past. Indeed, at this very moment in 1720, he was giving the pretender money to sort of maintain his court in exile. He's paying to, well, giving money to make sure that the Jacobite exiles, the courtiers, they're having their stipends still paid. So Stair is not totally irrational. However, he does leave France under a bit of a cloud. And this is really the Stair that has gone down in history from this time. Historians, and Saint-Simon in particular, this is what they represent. Stair as this curmudgeonly man who's stirring up trouble between Britain and France, pestering the regent about his, all ruining Anglo-French affairs just based on his personal antagonism against John Law. I think it's unfair to remember him in this way because if we put his spy network front and center, he did achieve quite a bit in France. He was able to provide some early warning against the Jacobite rising. He was able to deny some supplies and really stirred up an awful lot of fear among the British, the Jacobite exile community. He did devote an awful lot of energy to promoting the Hanoverian cause in France. That shouldn't be overlooked. And I hope that by focusing on the Stair as a spymaster, we can do our best to rehabilitate his historical reputation. So to wrap up, if by some miracle I've not put you off anti-Jacobite espionage, a couple of books if you want to learn some more. If you're interested in the Jacobite cause from this time, the best introduction is Daniel Shakey's book on the left-hand side of the slide. It's a great entryway into the Jacobite cause at this time. If you're more interested in the spy stuff, I'd recommend the book in the middle by Hugh Douglas, Jacobite Spy Wars. It mostly focuses on the later 1745 rising, but it does provide this great. It's very readable. It's been out of print for a few years, but it is. You can get a second-hand copy quite cheap, and it's focusing on these spies sent after Brother Charlie to try and track his movements and defeat the 1745 rising. It's a good read. And for anyone interested in France during the Regency, I would recommend James Buchan's biography of John Law. As I mentioned, he is scathing of Lord Stair. He presents him as almost the villain of this biography of John Law. But it is a great book. It's very readable. It shows quite insight into John Law's financial system and into France at this time. So if that's what you want to know about, I would really recommend it. Well, I think I've spoken for long enough. This is, I spent about 3 or 4 months researching this topic, and I've been able to include about a quarter of it in this talk. If you have any questions, please do let me know. But thank you so much for listening.